Hi, my name is Emily Weber, and this is my video project for Sociology 352 for Social Change. My social movement was the sex workers' rights movement, and the sex workers' rights social change movement is rooted in the idealistic factors such as values, ideologies, and beliefs. Coyote, a foundation out of Los Angeles, was organized in 1973 by Margot St. James. Coyote advocates for the rights of all sex workers. This includes strippers, sex phone operators, prostitutes, porn actresses, and porn actresses of all genders. They also work to prevent the scapegoating of sex workers for AIDS and other STDs, to educate all sex workers, their clients, and the general public about safe sex. Another example of a group with an idealistic perspective pertaining to the sex workers' rights movement is the North American Task Force on Prostitution, and they believe that sex workers should be able to work safely without legal repression, travel without legal restrictions, have families, and raise children, and that they should enjoy the same rights, responsibilities, and privileges of all other people. The North American Task Force on Prostitution also values their research. Their ideologies include engaging in public education, encouraging research to improve sex workers' lives, providing technical assistance in the development and evaluation of health and social services. They also organize conference workshops and panel discussions. They discuss sex work issues in the print and online. And they also provide speakers to lecture in colleges and university classes. The general model of social change for the sex workers' rights movement can be considered cyclical. According to our notes, the cyclical model is a repetitive view that does not deny that things change, but denies that the change is leading anywhere over the long haul. Having this belief that sex workers' rights are human rights has been going on for ages. However, law enforcement still abides by their catch-all standpoint, which criminalizes and endangers sex workers. And since human rights imply rights for all people, they should then extend towards the sex workers. However, because of the negative stigma, some citizens, police, and politicians don't hold that value to be true. Feminists have often protested that the standard lists of human rights don't sufficiently take into account differences between the risks that are faced by our men and women. For example, issues like domestic violence, reproductive choice, the trafficking of women and girls for sex work did not really have a prominent place in early human rights documentation or treaties. Lists of human rights have been expanded over time to include the degradation and violation of women. Recently, Melissa Petro wrote an article for Rewire News, and she explained that even though these bills are being passed through Congress, they might seem to be helping these sex workers receive these rights that they deserve. But there's more to it than meets the eye. The bill right now is the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, and this bill has been backed by celebrities as well as Congress. Still, Melissa Petro wrote that this legislation directly undermines all the stated values and the rights of sex workers by putting the services designed to help both consensual sex workers and victims of trafficking in jeopardy. And it closes all the avenues sex workers use across all spectrums, and which they rely on for their personal safety and their economic well-being. Sex workers' rights have been this ongoing conversation, and they have many idealistic factors, and that includes personal values and beliefs, and that really all comes into play. Sometimes a social problem such as this feels like the change is not leading anywhere over the long haul. And although there is this repetition with protesting and the constant struggle for these basic human rights, there does seem to be more fight for these fair and safe legislations. And with this endless support from our allies, this problem might no longer be cyclical in the future. The general perspective that best fits the sex workers' rights movement is the interactionist position. The interactionist view of Max Weber is that in order to understand social change, you have to focus not just on concrete behavior and events, but you also have to focus on the way they are interpreted and defined and shaped by the cultural meanings that people give to them. A concrete example of this different interpretation of sex workers is, well, first starting with how sex workers see themselves. And some may justify their work by viewing it as a job. And they're creating this important service for their clients or their companions. Another view comes from the feminist perspective. Neo-abolitionists, including radical and Marxist feminists, they say that prostitution is never entirely consensual, and it can't be regarded as such. Now, on the other hand, there is the sex-positive feminist view, and the sex-positive view argues that a woman has the right to choose prostitution and other forms of sex work for their employment, and it could even be for a career. Now, there's another interpretation as well, and that comes from the male view. And they have this lack of knowledge about the topic, and they also have an unwillingness to engage with sex workers, and they have proven that it has been hard to overcome these obstacles. Nevertheless, it is also suggested that men need to validate their sexual prowess, or they're reaffirming their masculinity. So they can't truly understand, and that's why their interpretation will always be different. There's continuous interaction between those who have different beliefs, values, and ideologies about sex work, but they never really see eye to eye. And according to our notes, the social structure of the sex workers' rights movement could be considered this temporary byproduct, because the focus of the social change is the change itself. Now, this interactionist perspective is the one that fits best, in my opinion. And, our notes state that those involved need to develop an identity and injustice frame of meaning. Now, the sex worker rights movement is made up of individuals who view themselves as an identifiable group with these common interests. Their common interests involve believing that they should have basic human rights because they are basic humans. And, the government should value that, and they should understand that they are humans too. Now, this common definition of the sex worker situation is that it is unjust for them not to partake in the rights of other citizens just because of their job. A woman named T.S. Piper Darling writes that, many people hold this idea that harsher policing will save more sex workers. And she writes that, that approach actually serves to continue the violence, and it destroys many factors regarding sex workers' safety. And the more that sex work is pushed underground and more harshly policed, the more unsafe this work really becomes. So the need for a change to laws and policies can help save these lives of sex workers. And for the most obvious group that needs to have their mind changed are the lawmakers, and then that will lead to changing the laws. The criminalization of sex work in the US is largely the reason why it can be so dangerous. And there are many groups and organizations that are standing up for sex workers' rights. Amnesty International is one of them. They have been working to decriminalize sex work. There is the Sex Workers Project that provides client-centered legal and social services to individuals who engage in sex work, whether they do so by choice or by circumstance or even coercion. Then there's another group called the Sex Workers Outreach Project, based out of the US, and that is a national social justice network dedicated to the fundamental human rights of people involved in the sex trade, and those people also involved in their community. They focus on ending the violence, ending the stigma, and that's through education and advocacy. There's also an alliance called the Desiree Alliance, and that's a national coalition of current and former sex workers. They work together, supporting each other, supporting other networks who believe that sex workers deserve these rights. And they really are working to improve understanding of sexual policies and its human, social, and political impacts of criminalization surrounding the globe. The web pages of Amnesty International, the Sex Workers Project, Sex Workers Outreach Project, and the Desiree Alliance all have these tabs where you can donate, you can become a member for the cause. Amnesty International even has a Get Involved section where you can take the smallest action and just keep building. You can become a member, you can just learn some skills, you can meet other activists, and that's all on their webpage. Neil Smeltzer's value-added theory is the best one that accounts for how sex workers' rights movement was started. Our notes state that his theory argues that there are 6 conditions necessary but not sufficient for a social movement to develop. So number 1, structural conductiveness encourage or rule out these certain kinds of issues which collective behavior and this movement develop. So sex workers' rights movement, they use phrases like sex workers' rights are human rights to show that sex workers are humans. They also use sex workers' rights are women's rights to show that some sex workers are women too and they need your support. And Amnesty International states that, sex workers are at the high risk of having their human rights abused in many countries around the world. Number 2, structural strains develop when there are perceived deprivations, inconsistencies, inequalities, and that all of these are perceived as oppressive. So those fighting for sex workers' rights, their main goal is that they want the removal of laws and policies that criminalize or penalize sex work. That includes the laws and regulations related to selling, buying, or organizing sex work. Now, they also want to only use the term sex work when referring to consensual exchanges between adults, not for human sex trafficking, not for child trafficking. They just want sex work to be for consensual exchanges between adults. So there are these perceived deprivations of sex workers' rights, such as their access to health care, their ability to report crimes to the authorities, their fear of being criminalized and being sent to jail because of their job, even though somebody had treated them badly. Their ability to organize and work together for an increased sense of safety. They don't have the comfort of knowing that their family won't be charged for living with them and living off of the proceeds of their sex work. Number 3, the emergence of a generalized belief system which defines the sources of the strains and points towards the solutions that would alleviate them. The biggest strain on the rights of sex workers are the laws that make what they do illegal. Now, to alleviate these strains, laws and policies just need to be changed. Amnesty International states that the government should protect, respect, and fulfill the rights of sex workers. This includes protection from harm, protection from exploitation and coercion. This is to ensure that sex workers and the people around them can be involved in the development of laws and policies because it affects their life and their safety. And they want just guaranteed access to health, education, and employment options regardless of what they have done in the past or what they currently do for a living. Number 4, precipitating events which focus public and media attention and galvanize this support. So every year there is a selection of local, national, and international events and campaigns which are sometimes even organized by sex workers and their allies. This includes International Sex Workers' Rights Day, which is on March 3rd. This also includes International Sex Workers' Day, which is on June 2nd, and International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers, which is on December 17th. And these are days that help bring awareness to the public, and they stimulate this support locally, nationally, and internationally, because this problem is global. Number 5, the emergence of leadership and of spokespeople and the development of these support organizations and the beginnings of recruitment. So there are many organizations that support sex workers' rights. I had talked about Amnesty International, the Desiree Alliance. There's also the Adult Performers Advocacy Committee, and they advocate to maintain and improve safety and working conditions in the adult film industry by giving these adult performers organized representation. And in these matters that affect their health, safety, and community, that is really necessary. There's also the Red Umbrella Project, which is a peer-led organization based in Brooklyn, New York, and they focus on a community organization and community advocacy to make policy and systemic change to support the rights of the sex workers. And number 6, the responses from the larger society. Unfortunately, securing the rights for sex workers is an ongoing battle, and it's still going on today. Supporters contest these laws and policies that can potentially harm sex workers even more. And the government, authorities, and Congress are passing laws and policies without first really knowing how they affect the sex workers and their allies. And if they would just sit down and talk policy and talk laws, they could get some laws passed that could truly be beneficial and help sex workers gain their human rights. The sex workers' rights movement can be categorized as an instrumental movement type. Our notes from reading state that the instrumental movements seek to change the structure of society, such as the civil rights movement and today's environmental movement. Now, this movement is a part of human rights and civil rights, and those who believe that sex workers deserve their basic human rights also believe that laws and policies have a huge effect on who is awarded their rights. And sex workers gathered in Manhattan to fight back against SESTA and FOSTA, which is a federal law passed under the guise of combating human sex trafficking. And it effectively destroyed the crucial online spaces for sex workers. While sex workers say this law is putting their lives at risk, it has invigorated the community and has pushed the issues facing sex workers into national consciousness. Now, before SESTA/FOSTA, getting the mainstream press to pay attention to the sex workers' rights movement was this unthinkable thing. And sex workers and their allies just want safe spaces and the decriminalization of sex work. So, sex worker-led actions are part of a growing movement for this decriminalization of prostitution. And it's really gaining a lot of momentum and support. And to help change the structure of society, supporters of human rights for sex workers spoke to Congress and congressional staffers during a sex work lobby day in Washington, D.C. And one activist stated that, lawmakers didn't seem to realize that this law was about anything other than child sex trafficking before it was passed. And critics also believe that, this law is written too vaguely and too broadly to effectively really help the victims of trafficking. And after talking with some of the lawmakers about the effects that this law had on their community, they were sort of shocked and wanted to then start doing whatever they could to try and help make it right. But, Amnesty International states it best, and policy outlines what governments should do to better protect them. And sex workers' rights are at a high risk of abuse. And the government needs to talk hand in hand with sex workers and their allies to solve this problem. Otherwise, it's just going to be them going back and forth and in circles and not truly understanding the problem. The change agents for the sex workers' rights movement include both individuals and groups working together to bring about the change. And in February 2018, the Global Alliance Against Traffic in Women published their new report, Sex Workers Organizing for Change: Self-Representation, Community Mobilization, and Working Conditions. This report documents how organizing has enabled sex workers to deal with some of the ongoing stigma and discrimination that they face from society and the authorities, and to prevent and address the violence and the coercion and the exploitation occurring in their sex industry. Many of these groups working to bring about change for sex workers are made up of current or former sex workers, along with those who are advocates for them. And a group working to bring out some change for sex workers is HIPS, and HIPS' vision on their website states, "We believe that those engaged in sex work, sex trade, and drug use should be able to live healthy, self-determined, and self-sufficient lives, free from stigma, violence, criminalization, or oppression. We will achieve this through engaging sex workers, drug users, and our communities in challenging structural barriers to health, safety, and prosperity." So, the target population of this social movement is pretty large, and the sex workers' rights movement is constantly working towards their main goal, which is getting laws and policies changed, which means they must persuade the government as well as voters. Also, the movement works towards humanizing sex workers, and Stepping Stone Nova Scotia used a series of advertisements which were made in order to help humanize sex workers. And it stated that sex workers are brothers and sisters and daughters and mothers too. The advertisements were intended to shock the readers into really thinking about prostitutes. And there were words like tramp and hooker next to pictures of white middle-class faces who are family members of those who are involved in sex work. And it makes the viewer question our culture's ease of using these slang words, and it forces us to see the person behind the prostitute. And Stepping Stone Nova Scotia, their mission was to just advocate on the behalf of sex workers, and to offer resources and services to the prostitutes of maritime provinces in Canada. The sex workers' rights movement uses facilitative and re-educative strategies to bring about their desired change. So our notes state that the facilitative strategies should be used when targeted, when the targeted reference group recognizes there's a problem and that there's a need for change. So, Washington Police Chief Peter Newsham said that We can't arrest our way out of prostitution. Our response to poverty and lack of traditional employment must be based in supportive services and housing. The district will not solve anything by criminalizing people for doing what they need to survive. Criminalizing people does not solve the problem, and the sex workers' rights movement knows that, but they're also willing to engage in self-help. And the Sex Workers Outreach Program, based out of the U.S., has an entire webpage geared towards safety, self-care, resources, and so on. These links are to support, advice, additional resources, tips that can be found from other sex workers. There's also important phone numbers on the bottom of their webpage, which are numbers to the Sex Workers Warm Line, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, National Suicide Hotline, and the National Rape Crisis Hotline. The goal of the sex workers' rights movement is pretty broad. Basic human rights for sex workers, bottom line. However, that can be broken down into several subcategories. Sex workers' legal rights, decriminalization of sex work, creating safe spaces for sex workers, and this desired change requires active participation from sex workers, sex worker advocacy groups, government officials who can change these laws and policies, voters, and communities all over the nation. The sex workers' rights movement also uses the re-educative strategy to bring about their desired change. Our notes state that the re-educative strategy usually involves unlearning or overcoming prior learning. And our notes continue that re-education is effective and often necessary when the reference public doesn't have the necessary skills or knowledge to make use of an innovation, or when their fears, anxieties, or moral barriers to adapt this innovation don't exist. And advocacy groups of sex workers try to create this rationale for why sex workers should receive basic human rights. And Amnesty International even has a question and answer page on their website, and they want to re-educate people. They want to show people who may not understand why sex workers' rights are also human rights, why they are. And their first question on their webpage is, why does Amnesty International need a policy to protect the human rights of sex workers? And their answer was, because sex workers are at a high risk of human rights abuses in many countries around the world, and our policy outlines what governments should do better to protect them. Amnesty International also lists why sex workers are at risks of, a loss of their basic human rights. Rape, violence, trafficking, extortion, arbitrary arrest and detention, their forced eviction from their homes, harassment, discrimination, exclusion from health services, and the list goes on. Re-educating is important to sex workers because what people think in the U.S. when they think of prostitution is what they see on the street. However, that's because street prostitution is the most visible. And although street-based sex workers receive, the brunt of discrimination, they're also more frequently arrested and may get into some serious situations that they don't have the legal means to get out of. And the only thing about that is that, the majority of prostitution in the U.S. actually resides behind closed doors, and it's hidden. And, with new knowledge and skills offered by these sex worker advocacy groups, we learn this, and we understand how these organizations are trying to target this population and, try to get them to understand that we need to adopt this change. There are many actions and events that make up the change process for the sex workers' rights movement, one of which includes partaking in protests. And, hundreds of people took part in a protest through London's Soho district, and that was on International Women's Day against criminalization of sex work on March 8th, 2018 in London, England. But it's also about getting the government and politicians to listen, to want to make a change, and to undertake all of the struggles that these sex workers have been going through to get this change. They want others to participate in that as well. A queer, non-binary sex worker and community organizer named Red says that what's most important here should be centering the voices of people doing sex work and in the trade, and who are survivors of trafficking, who know what's best for their well-being and their futures. Red continues that if politicians actually listen to sex workers on how to help support survivors who have actually experienced the violence of trafficking, there would be just a decline of arrests, and there would be expanded access to emergency immigrant visas, and there could be expanse in housing and food and cash assistance programs for people in the sex industry. So in conclusion, the sex workers' rights movement has been effective in re-educating and creating safe spaces for workers and, getting the attention of politicians. However, the change process is just ongoing, and the re-education and the changing of policies and laws, it takes time. So trying to give sex workers the rights they deserve has proven to be a challenge, and sometimes sex workers don't want to expose themselves to the public scrutiny. Meanwhile, government officials have not always asked what is best for the sex workers, and they create policies and laws that can do more harm than good. So the best way to help the sex workers' rights movement is to keep advocating, keep creating safe spaces, share stories, and engage with sex workers to best understand what's right for them. Thank you.